Welcome to Inside the Philippines. Most of the stories we tell on this channel are the kind you watch with your hand over your mouth. Men who lost their savings. Men who lost their houses. Men who flew halfway around the world for a woman who turned out to have a husband already. A family they were already supporting. A whole second life running parallel to the one she'd shown him on a screen. We've told those stories. We'll tell more of them. This one is different. Today's story comes from Brendan. He's 67 years old. He's from County Leitrim in the northwest of Ireland. He spent the better part of his life working underground in one of the last coal mines in the country. And when that was gone, he spent the rest of it keeping other things from falling apart. He is not, by his own description, a dramatic man. But when Brendan arrived in the Philippines, he thought he knew what he was doing. He'd done his research. He'd watched the videos. He thought he'd prepared for every angle. He hadn't prepared for this one. Here is his story, in his own words. I'll start with what I actually was, because I think it matters. 31 years underground. Arigna, County Roscommon. Coal. Real coal. Black and wet. Pulled out of the earth up in the hills above Lough Allen. I started at 19, and I was there until they closed the place in 1990. If you're not from that part of Ireland, you've probably never heard of Arigna, and there's no reason you should have. It was never a big operation. A few hundred men at peak, much less toward the end. But it was work, and it was honest. And I was good at it. Underground work does something to the way you think. You develop a particular kind of attention. Not paranoia, nothing like that. More like you're always registering. The sounds, the structure, whether something has shifted since yesterday. Men who didn't pay that kind of attention tended to have bad days, and in a mine, a bad day means something different than it does in an office. So you learn. You follow procedure not because someone tells you to, but because you've seen what happens when the procedure gets ignored. When the mine closed, I moved into maintenance work. Facilities, equipment, keeping the lights on at various places around the county. Steadier hours, drier conditions. Not the same. I won't pretend it was the same, but I had a family by then. Marie and I had been married 4 years when Arigna shut. We had the first 2 kids already, and Caitlin arrived the year after. So you adapt. You do what needs doing. Marie died in November of 2017. Breast cancer. She was diagnosed in 2015, and she fought it the way she fought everything, which was quietly and without any fuss, and with considerably more dignity than I would have managed. I was with her at the end. The kids came home. All 3 of them, which I was glad of. We buried her in the churchyard in Ballinamore, and then they went back. Ciaran to Toronto, Sinead to Brisbane, Fionnuala to London. Within the week, more or less. They had jobs, lives. It made sense. I told myself that for about 6 years. The house in Leitrim was a 3-bedroom semi I'd bought in 1988 and extended twice. Good solid house. Good garden. More than enough room for the 2 of us when the kids were grown and gone, and considerably too much room for one. I rattled around in it. I'm not complaining. I want to be clear about that. I have a friend from the mine days, Paddy, who lost his wife young and had it much harder than I did. I had my health, my pension, my faculties. I was fine. Fine is a strange word, though. Fine means functional. It doesn't mean anything else. I retired from maintenance work in 2021 at 64. The state pension kicked in at 66. Between that and the miner's pension, I was landing roughly €2,000 a month, which in rural Leitrim, with a mortgage-free house, is more than adequate. I had savings too, built up slowly over 40-odd years. call it €90,000, give or take. I was comfortable. Not rich, but I've never needed to be rich. What I didn't have was any particular reason to be where I was. Kairan rang at Christmas, usually. And Sinead sent pictures of the grandchildren I've met twice. Fionuala was the closest geographically, and still managed to visit once in 2019 and once in 2022. I don't say this to make them sound like bad people. They're not bad people. They're busy people who grew up and built lives somewhere else, the way young people do, the way I suppose we raised them to. It's just that understanding something doesn't make it feel any different. In the spring of 2023, I sold the house. I told the solicitor it was a good time to sell, which it was. I told my sister Attracta that I wanted to simplify, which was also true. I told Paddy over a pint that I fancied a change of scene, and he said that was grand. And where was I thinking? And I told him the Philippines. And he looked at me the way men look at you when they want to say you've lost your mind but haven't the heart. I'd been watching videos online for the better part of a year by then. Not the romance ones, not at first. The practical ones. Cost of living, visa requirements, where to find accommodation, what the healthcare situation was like. I watched those the way I used to read safety manuals. Methodically, taking notes, cross-checking details. Then I started finding the other kind. The cautionary ones. Men sitting in their kitchens describing how they'd sent €40,000 to women they'd never met. Men who'd built houses on land that turned out not to be theirs. Men who'd wired money for emergencies that kept multiplying. I watched those too. I watched them carefully. And I want to be honest about what I thought when I watched those videos. I didn't think, poor Egypt, there, but for the grace of God. I thought, I wouldn't do that. I thought I could see exactly where each of those men had gone wrong, and exactly which moment I would have stopped and said no, and walked away. I was a man who'd spent 30 years in an environment that killed you if you got complacent. And I was not, I told myself, a complacent man. I was right about that. Mostly. But there were things I hadn't anticipated, and one of them turned out to matter more than almost anything else, and it had nothing to do with women or money or romance. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Why the Philippines and not somewhere else? That's what people ask. The honest answer is English. I am 67 years old and from Leitrim, and I have no aptitude whatsoever for foreign languages. I need to be able to read a sign. I need to be able to tell a doctor where it hurts. Thailand is cheaper in places, but I'd be functionally illiterate. Vietnam is beautiful from what I've seen, but the same problem. Spain or Portugal would have kept me in the EU, with all the complications that brings since the Brexit mess. And besides the cost of living, there has gone up considerably. The Philippines ticked the boxes. English, warm, affordable, and far enough that it was genuinely somewhere else. I sold the house for €240,000. After the solicitor and the estate agent and a few other bits, I cleared just over $200,000. I put 150 of that into a savings account I resolved not to touch. And the rest I kept liquid. I booked a one-way flight to Cebu. One way because I wanted to mean it. The flight was 14 hours with a stop in Abu Dhabi, and I spent most of it reading a guide to Cebu City that I'd downloaded onto my phone in Balinamore. I had a window seat. I remember watching the clouds beneath us, somewhere over the Middle East, flat and white, and thinking, well, you've done it now. Cebu Airport is called Mactan Cebu International, and it looks exactly like an airport should, which is to say, it tells you nothing whatsoever about where you are. It was only when I stepped outside with my 2 cases that it hit me. The heat first, like opening an oven door. Then the noise, motorbikes and jeepneys, and a man with a microphone announcing something I couldn't follow, and underneath all of it, this low, constant, no living hum that I later came to understand was just the city breathing. I stood there for probably 30 seconds doing nothing at all. Then I got a grab to the guest house I'd booked near IT Park in La Hague. The guest house was clean and cost 1,100 pesos a night, which is roughly 18 euro. The bed was fine, the air conditioning worked. The woman at the front desk spoke better English than most people I'd dealt with in various government offices back home, and she said "Good morning, Po," and meant it. I put my cases down, lay on the bed fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling for a while. I wasn't having second thoughts. I want to be clear about that. It was more that the reality of the thing had arrived in a way the planning hadn't quite conveyed. I'd been ready for the Philippines as a concept. The actual Philippines, the smell of it. You're the diesel and heat and frangipani and something frying somewhere not far away. That was a slightly different matter. I spent 4 days in that guest house sorting out the apartment. I'd done most of the research from home, but there were a few places I wanted to see in person before committing. Mandaue City is just north of Cebu City proper, connected to it in the way that one town bleeds into the next along a busy road. It's not a tourist destination. Nobody goes to Mandaue for the scenery. What it has is ordinary working life. Markets and hardware shops, and Mang Inasal restaurants, and the kind of residential streets where people park their tricycles outside their houses and kids play basketball on courts that seem to appear every 400 meters, without exception. I liked it for the same reason I'd liked Origna, actually. And it wasn't performing for anyone. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a mid-rise building on a side street off AS Fortuna. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a gas hob and a small balcony that looked out over the roof of a sari-sari store. The building had a security guard on the door who greeted everyone with more genuine warmth than I was used to from that kind of role. The rent was 22,000 pesos a month, roughly 370 euro, which included water but not electric. I did the maths. My 2 pensions combined came to about 2,000 euro a month. Even with electric, food, and transport, I'd be spending perhaps a third of that. The rest could sit quietly in the savings account and do nothing. I signed a 6-month lease. Cash deposit, first and last month. Standard enough. The 2-bedroom thing I've already mentioned. A 1-bedroom in the same building was 18,000 pesos, about 300 euro. And the 2-bedroom was 4,000 pesos more, and gave me an extra room I had no immediate use for. I told myself it was for storage. I had tools back in Leitrim that I was having shipped out, some woodworking gear, a few other bits. That was the reasoning. It was sound reasoning. It was also, I recognized later, the kind of reasoning a man constructs when he's not quite ready to admit to the simpler explanation. The first 3 weeks were disorienting in ways I hadn't budgeted for. I knew the language. That's what I'd told myself. English everywhere. And it's true. Filipinos speak excellent English, genuinely excellent, better than adequate, and yet somehow I still felt like I was missing something constantly, some register or context or joke that everyone else was in on. The rhythm of transactions was different. The way prices worked was different. I'd go to the market near the Gaisano Grand Mall and point at vegetables and whatever number they told me I'd pay, because I had no reference point and no one to tell me otherwise. I ate at the same 2 places for the first 2 weeks, a turo-turo around the corner where I could point at things in the trays, and a chowking on the main road where the menu had pictures. This is not a proud admission for a man who fancied himself well prepared, but there it is. The heat was the other thing. I'd read about tropical heat, and I'd been to Spain twice on holiday with Marie, and I thought I understood hot. I didn't. Not this kind. By 9 in the morning in Mandaue, you're already thinking about shade. By noon, the light has a quality to it that I can only describe as aggressive. And I bought an electric fan for the bedroom within the first week, even though the flat had air conditioning, because the air conditioning was expensive to run, and I was still calibrating my electricity bill, and the fan was 850 pesos from a hardware shop on AS Fortuna, which is about €14. And sometimes the simpler solution is the right one. I went to the SM City Cebu one afternoon in the second week, partly because I needed a few things from the hardware section, and partly because I'd read it was air-conditioned throughout, which on that particular day seemed reason enough. It is an enormous building. I walked around it for 2 hours, bought a dish rack and a set of hangers, and a bag of dried mango from a stall near the entrance, and ate lunch alone at a table in the food court, watching families and couples and groups of young people and thinking, not unhappily, just observationally, that I was probably the only person in the entire building who was entirely by themselves. I was fine with that. Fine. Again. Functional. It was a Tuesday evening near the end of my third week when someone knocked on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it, and there was a man about my age, heavy-set, red-faced, in the way Australians go red rather than tan, wearing a polo shirt with a small stain near the pocket that he hadn't noticed or didn't care about. He introduced himself as Phil. He said he was in the flat at the end of the corridor, and he'd seen me coming and going and thought he'd say hello, and did I fancy a San Miguel? I said I did. We sat on Phil's balcony, which was identical to mine, but had 2 plastic chairs and a small table, which told you something about the difference between us at that point. He had a partner, Marisel, he said. She was at her sister's that evening, and he'd been in Mandaue 4 years. Before that, he'd been in Brisbane running construction projects for 22 years, and before that, various sites around Queensland and Western Australia. He spoke the way men from that background speak, which is to say, economically and with occasional dry asides that took me a moment to register as jokes. We drank 2 San Miguels each and talked about the building, the neighborhood, the visa situation, the best place to get a decent breakfast. Normal enough conversation. Then he asked me, fairly directly, whether I was managing all right on my own. I said I was grand. He nodded. I said nothing for a moment. Then he said I should think about getting a helper. I wasn't sure I'd heard him right at first. Or rather, I'd heard him, but I wasn't sure what he meant by it. In Ireland, the word helper doesn't have that specific a meaning. I said something to that effect. He said, not a girlfriend, a helper, someone who comes in the mornings, cleans, does laundry, maybe leaves a meal ready. He said the going rate was somewhere between 4,500 pesos and 5,000 pesos a month. He said that was roughly 75 to 80 euro. I told him I was perfectly capable of cleaning my own flat. He said he knew that. He said that wasn't the point. He said the point was that it cost almost nothing, that it gave someone local employment at a fair wage, and that it would save me time and effort I could use for other things. And he also said, and this is the bit I remember most clearly, that having a helper meant having someone in the flat regularly who actually knew how things worked around here. He said his first 3 months, before Marisel, he'd been overcharged for everything and had no idea. He said a good helper pays for herself inside a fortnight. I said I'd feel like a colonial. He said I'd feel like a colonial for about a week, and then I'd eat a proper hot meal for the first time in months, and I'd get over it. I thought about it for a few days. My resistance was genuine. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't false modesty. There's something in the way I was raised, and in the culture of the work I did, where asking for help with basic tasks carries a weight it probably doesn't for other people. Men in the mine did everything themselves. That was the expectation. You fixed your own equipment. You sorted your own problems. You didn't make yourself a burden on anyone else. It was a practical philosophy. It kept things functioning. But Phil's argument was also practical, and I couldn't find a flaw in it. So I decided to approach it the way I'd approach anything unfamiliar. Carefully, with the proper documentation in order. I found an agency through a search online and verified them before I rang. Asked for their business registration, asked about their screening process. They confirmed they required NBI clearance. That's the National Bureau of Investigation, the Philippine equivalent of a police background check, and a barangay clearance from the candidate's local area, and they kept copies of all documents on file. The contract they used covered working hours, duties, a rate of pay, notice periods, and grounds for termination on both sides. It was more thorough than I'd expected, and the thoroughness reassured me. This was a legitimate operation with proper paperwork. I told them I needed someone 5 mornings a week, 7 to noon. Cleaning, laundry, basic tidying. I said I'd handle my own dinner. The woman at the agency, I think her name was Gina, said that was fine, and she'd arrange for me to meet a few candidates. She sent 3 women over the course of that week, 1 each on separate mornings. The first 2 were perfectly pleasant. The first was young, maybe mid-20s, and very eager to please in a way that I found slightly exhausting. She kept saying yes, Po, to everything I said before I'd finished saying it, which made me nervous rather than confident. And the second was more experienced, but her references were thin, and when I tried to follow up on one of them, the number went unanswered. The third was Marisel. She was 43, from somewhere in Leyte, the island east of Cebu, and she'd worked for 3 foreign households in Cebu over the previous 8 years. She had a folder with her documents in it, and she handed it to me before I'd asked, which I appreciated. NBI clearance, barangay clearance, a letter from her previous employer, a photocopy of her ID. She sat in the chair across from me in the living room and answered my questions without embellishment. Previous duties: cleaning, laundry, cooking breakfast and lunch, market shopping. Reason for leaving the last position: the employer had gone back to the UK due to a family matter. She could provide his contact details if I wanted to verify. I said I would, and she wrote the number down on a piece of paper and handed it over. No hesitation. I called the number that afternoon. A Scotsman named Douglas answered on the 3rd ring. He said Marisel was reliable, honest, and had worked for him for 2 years without a single problem. He said the only thing he'd change was he'd hired her earlier. That was enough for me. I called the agency the next morning and said I wanted to proceed with Marisel. We signed the contract, the agency's standard form, which I read in full, which took about 20 minutes, which I think surprised Gina slightly. Rate of pay: 4,500 pesos per month, paid on the 1st of each month. Hours: 7 in the morning to noon, Monday through Friday. Duties as discussed. 1 month's notice required from either party to terminate the arrangement. I remember the feeling when I signed it. Not excitement, not relief exactly, just a kind of clarity. Here was a defined arrangement with defined terms, and both parties knew exactly what they were agreeing to. After years of relationships, with family, with employers, with the general ambient expectations of the world, where obligations accumulated silently and were never quite spoken aloud, there was something almost restful about a piece of paper that said exactly what this was and wasn't. Marisel arrived the following Monday at 7 o'clock in the morning. I heard the knock, opened the door, and she was standing there with her bag and a pair of indoor slippers that she changed into in the doorway, which I didn't know yet was standard practice, but which I later came to understand as simple consideration for the floors. I showed her where everything was. the cleaning supplies, the laundry machine, the shelves. I said I'd be on the balcony reading and to let me know if she had any questions. She said, "Yes, Po," and went to work. I made myself scarce. It seemed the right thing to do. By noon she had cleaned the flat, done a load of laundry, and left a plate of sinangag and fried egg wrapped in cling film in the fridge, with a handwritten note that said, "The rice was from last night's leftovers, so I should eat it today." She was gone before I came back inside. I stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the plate. The flat was clean in a way it hadn't been since I'd arrived. The floors were done. The bathroom was done. There was no longer a ring around the kitchen sink that I'd been meaning to address for 2 weeks. I ate the sinangag. It was good. Garlic rice with a fried egg, simple as that. And it was the best thing I'd eaten since I'd landed. And I'm not going to pretend that was nothing. It wasn't nothing. But the thing I kept coming back to wasn't the food or the clean floors. It was the note. The small, practical detail, offered without being asked, from someone who'd paid attention on her first day and acted accordingly. I thought, all right, this might work. The first incident happened about 10 days in, and it was small enough that I might not have noticed if Marisel hadn't been there. I'd arranged for a tricycle to take me to the market on Wano Avenue, the one I'd started using once I'd found my way around a bit. I'd used the same driver twice before, a man named Dante who had a sticker of the Santo Niño on his dashboard and always had the radio on at a volume that made conversation difficult. He quoted me 300 pesos for the journey, about €5. It hadn't occurred to me to question it. Marisel was in the kitchen when I came back in to get my bag. She must have heard the figure through the open door. She appeared in the hallway and said, quite softly, "That was an 80-peso ride." "Sir." I looked at her. She didn't elaborate. She just looked back at me with an expression that wasn't quite anything. Not accusatory, not pitying, just informational. This is the rate. That is not the rate. I paid Dante 80 pesos. He didn't argue. He wasn't embarrassed. He just took the money and drove off, which told me this was simply how it worked with foreigners who didn't know better. And probably he'd have been more surprised if I hadn't been corrected than the other way around. I sat with that for a while after I got home. I thought about the turo, where I'd been paying whatever they said, and the bottled water from the sari-sari store on the corner. 35 pesos a bottle without question. The grab rides I'd been tipping generously because I felt guilty, which I've since learned is not a local custom. None of it was ruinous. 300 pesos instead of 80 pesos is €3.50. But multiply €3.50 by every transaction I'd been making for 10 days, by 30 days, by 12 months. It adds up. Not to ruin, but to the particular financial drift of a man who doesn't know the terrain and has no one to tell him. Within the same month, she'd sorted the water, too. I'd been buying 35 peso bottles from the shop on the corner, about 55 cents each, and going through 3 or 4 a day in the heat. One morning, she arrived with a slip of paper. A standing delivery order she'd arranged with a supplier, 12 pesos a bottle, I delivered to the door twice weekly. She didn't announce it as a saving. She just showed me the receipt and said where she'd left the first delivery. The maths was obvious. I said thank you. She said yes, Po, and went back to the laundry. The fish market came next, and this one I think about more than the others. She'd offered to come with me to the wet market one Saturday, said she could help me find the best stalls. I said that would be grand, and she came along, and we were barely inside when a man called me over from his display and told me in excellent English that he had very fresh lapu-lapu today, just arrived. It did look reasonable. I was about to ask the price. Marisel had already moved to look at it. She bent down slightly, did something with her nose that I couldn't quite parse, and then said to me quietly, "Hindi sariwa, I'm not fresh," and walked, without waiting for me, to a stall 3 rows further in where she spoke to the woman in Cebuano for about 40 seconds, and then turned back to me and said this one. I didn't ask how she knew. Men in the mine didn't ask how a veteran knew there was a problem with the support timber before anyone else did. They just accepted that experience accumulated into a kind of knowing that was faster than reasoning, and they trusted it. I bought the fish from the other stall. It was good. But the 4th incident is the one I think matters most for anyone watching this who's thinking of doing what I did. And this one wasn't small. I'd been thinking about approaching my landlord about the rent. My lease was 6 months and coming up for renewal. And I'd had the idea, seemed sensible at the time, of offering to pay 6 months in advance in exchange for locking in the current rate. It was the kind of thing I'd have done at home without a second thought. Show good faith, get certainty in return. I mentioned this to Marisel one morning. She was mopping the kitchen floor. She stopped, didn't put the mop down, just stopped moving it, and looked at me with an expression I recognized from the mine days. The expression of an experienced man watching someone new approach a section of roof that had a problem he couldn't yet see. "Sir," she said, "I would not do that." I asked why. She didn't give me a lecture. She didn't explain the full mechanics of it. She just said, sometimes when a landlord has the money already, it is more difficult to get things fixed. That was all. And I didn't send the 6 months. I renewed on standard monthly terms. I mentioned it to Phil over a San Miguel the following week, and he laughed, not unkindly, and explained the full picture. Landlords in the Philippines who receive large advance payments sometimes become suddenly unavailable when the air conditioning breaks, or the plumbing starts giving trouble, or the building needs maintenance. The leverage is gone. What are you going to do? Complain? You've already paid. This happens enough that it's known. I hadn't known it. I'd been about to hand over 132,000 pesos, 2,200 euro, for the comfort of a fixed rate, and I'd have spent the following months with no tool to compel anyone to fix anything. Marisel's monthly salary was 4,500 pesos. That's roughly 75 euro. In her first month she had, by conservative estimate, saved me considerably more than that in overcharges, bad fish, overpriced water, and one decision that could have become a significant headache. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for why this story is useful. She wasn't doing any of this because she liked me especially, or because she was angling for something, or because she had any stake in my financial well-being beyond the most basic professional interest. She was doing it because it was her job, and she was good at her job, and being good at her job meant the household she worked in ran properly. That's all it was. A woman who knew the terrain, doing her work with competence and a certain quiet dignity. I'd spent 3 weeks in Mandaue feeling like a man trying to navigate a darkened shaft without a lamp. I hadn't been in danger exactly, but I hadn't been in control either. And here was something I hadn't anticipated, that the first real footing I found wouldn't come from a visa agent or a YouTube video or a fellow expat with opinions. It would come from someone in indoor slippers who got to my flat at 7 in the morning and showed me a receipt. By the end of month 3, the flat had a rhythm. I knew which stalls at the market were trustworthy. I knew the fair rate for a trike, and which grab drivers were reliable. I knew what things should cost, and what I should push back on. Small things, all of it. But a mind that functions is made up of small things working properly, and a mind that fails is usually a sequence of small things that nobody bothered to address. The apartment felt less like a place I was waiting in. It felt, slowly, like somewhere I lived. By month 4, I knew a few things about Marisel that I hadn't known at the start. I knew she had a daughter named Christine, 17, doing her third year of secondary school back in their home in eastern Leyte. I knew she sent money home on the 15th of each month, 8,000 pesos or so, about 130 euros, and that this transfer was the fixed point around which everything else in her financial life was organized. I knew she attended Mass on Sunday mornings at the church 2 streets over, the one whose bells I could hear from my balcony at 6 in the morning if I happened to be awake, which I often was. I knew she was good at her work, and took it seriously, and had a particular way of folding laundry that was more efficient than any method I'd used in 40 years of looking after myself. I knew all this the way you come to know things about someone you share a working space with. Not through conversation exactly, but through accumulation. A detail here, a mention there. I didn't ask questions. She didn't volunteer more than was natural. The arrangement worked because the lines were clear. It was a Wednesday morning in the 4th month when she asked me for something. I was on the balcony with my coffee, looking out over the sari-sari store roof, and she came to the doorway and stood there for a moment before speaking. I noticed the standing. Marisel was not a woman who stood in doorways without purpose. She had something to say and was working out how to say it. She said she was sorry to ask. She said she knew it was outside the arrangement. She said her daughter's school fees were due for the semester. 8,000 pesos, on about 130 euro, and she was short this month because she'd had to send extra home the previous month when her mother had been unwell. She said she understood completely if the answer was no. She said it twice. She understood if the answer was no. I said I'd think about it and let her know. She nodded and went back inside, and I heard the sound of the mop resuming. I sat with it for 2 days. Not because of the money. 130 euro is not a significant sum to me, and I'd like to be clear about that. The savings account I've barely touched has been sitting there for a year and a half, and 130 euro would not be noticed in it. That wasn't what I was deliberating. What I was deliberating was what yes would mean. I thought about the men in those videos I'd watched in Leitrim. Every one of them could trace their trouble back to a single moment where a line was crossed that seemed, at the time, completely reasonable. Not even a line. More like a very slight change of direction, barely perceptible, that only revealed itself as significant when you were far enough along to look back. A small gesture of kindness, a favor returned. A door opened just a crack. None of it dramatic. None of it obviously wrong. And I thought about the mine, about the way structural problems develop. You don't get a collapse that announces itself. You get drift, imperceptible pressure, applied slowly, in the same direction, over time. The men who got into trouble underground were the ones who addressed each small thing in isolation rather than seeing the pattern. This bolt is loose. This prop has shifted. This section has settled. And individually, none of them were emergencies. Together, they were a shaft about to come down. I wasn't accusing Marisel of anything. I wasn't even suspicious, particularly. She'd given me 4 months of honest, competent work, and her request had been made with genuine discomfort. I believed the school fees were real. I believed her daughter existed and needed them paid. The Philippines has millions of women doing exactly what Marisel was doing, working away from home, sending money back, holding entire families together across the distance, and the financial pressure of that is constant and real. I understood it the way I understood the kids moving to Toronto and Brisbane and London. People go where the work is. They carry the weight of it. But understanding something doesn't mean you should act on it. Not in a particular direction. I said no to the school fees. I told her on the Friday, in the doorway again, and I said it straight, but I said it carefully. I said the arrangement worked well, and I wanted to keep it as it was, and that meant keeping it professional, and lending money, even as a gesture, would change something about it that I didn't want changed. I said I hoped she understood. She said, "Yes, Po," and that was that. But I didn't leave it at just the no. I thought about it over the weekend. On the Monday, I told her I'd been reviewing the arrangement, and I thought the rate I'd started her on was a bit low for someone of her experience and reliability, and that from the first of the following month, her salary would be 5,500 pesos a month. That's about €90, an increase of roughly €15. I framed it as a performance review. Not a consolation, not a response to the ask. Just an employer reviewing the rate and adjusting it. She accepted. She said, "Thank you." She came back Tuesday, and the bathroom was immaculate. I told Phil about it that weekend, and he nodded slowly and said I'd handled it well. Then he explained something I hadn't known, which was that in Filipino culture, the way you decline something matters as much as the declining. Saving face, haya, he called it, is genuinely important. A flat refusal with nothing attached leaves a person in a position of having failed by asking, which creates a shame that lingers. But a refusal paired with something, a raise, a bonus, a gesture of separate goodwill that isn't the thing being asked for, allows both parties to move forward without either of them having lost anything significant. Oh, you've said no, and they've still left with something. The equation balances. He said he'd learned that the hard way early in his time here. I'd apparently arrived at it through instinct, which he found mildly amusing. I didn't think it was instinct. I think it was the mine. You don't tell a man his work is inadequate without giving him something to work toward. You don't close a road without opening an alternative. You maintain the structure by keeping all the parts functional, including the ones that aren't your direct responsibility. A few months after that, I hired a second person, Ryan, 19 years old, referred by the building's security guard, whose nephew he was. 2 mornings a week, Tuesday and Thursday, for heavy cleaning, and the small strip of garden on the ground floor that the landlord had allocated to the flat, to 2,500 pesos a month, about €40. He was cheerful and thorough, and had absolutely no opinion about trike fares or fish freshness, but he could shift furniture without complaint, and the garden stopped looking abandoned. My total household costs were now: rent 22,000 pesos, Marisel 5,500 pesos, Ryan 2,500 pesos, electric roughly 2,000 to 2,500 pesos, depending on the month, food and transport about 15,000 pesos. Call it 50,000 pesos a month in total, about €830. My pensions covered it with room left over, and I hadn't gone near the savings account since I'd arrived. The second bedroom still had my tools in it, the woodworking gear I'd shipped over from Litrim. I'd started using them occasionally on weekend afternoons, making small things: a set of shelves for the kitchen, a small table for the balcony to replace the plastic one. Nothing important, just something to do with my hands. The apartment felt, by the end of that 4th month, like a place where things worked properly, which sounds like a small thing. It isn't. I want to tell you about the things that almost went wrong, not the things that did go wrong. There wasn't a dramatic unraveling, no moment where I sat in a Jollibee at midnight contemplating what I'd done with my life. This isn't that kind of story. But there were moments, spread across months 5 through 12, where I could see clearly how a different man, or the same man on a different day, might have let the structure drift until it became something he couldn't manage. The first was small and happened so gradually I nearly missed it. Around month 6, I noticed Marisel was arriving a few minutes early. Not alarmingly early. 6:45. And then a few days later, 6:40. The following week, 6:30. Each time by itself meant nothing. Together, across 3 weeks, it was a pattern. She wasn't doing anything wrong exactly. She was working during those extra minutes, getting an earlier start on things. And I suspect if I'd asked her, she'd have said she was simply being diligent, which she was. But the hours in the contract said 7. 7 meant something. It meant I had until 7 to myself, to have my coffee in peace, to be not yet at work, in the sense of being in a household that was actively being maintained around me. I mentioned it one morning. Not sharply. I said something like, "The 7 o'clock start works well for me. Let's keep to that. I appreciate the diligence, but I don't need the extra time." She said, "Of course, Po." And from the following Monday she arrived at 7. Exactly 7. And that was the end of it. I've thought about why I bothered. 30 minutes in the morning, what does it matter? But in the mine, you learn that the things that don't matter are exactly the things you need to address, because by the time something matters, it's already late. A prop that's shifted 2 centimeters is a prop you straighten. You don't wait until it's shifted 20. Problems don't announce themselves. They accumulate. The second thing happened in month 7, and it came from outside the arrangement entirely. Marisel had a cousin, or possibly a cousin's wife, I was never entirely clear on the relation, named Aling Nena, who appeared one morning while I was on the balcony reading. She was maybe 50, friendly, cheerful, and with the kind of immediate warmth that the Philippines does genuinely and abundantly, and which I'd learned by then to receive with appreciation while keeping my hands in my pockets, so to speak. She and Marisel spoke in Cebuano in the kitchen for a few minutes. Then Aling Nena appeared at the balcony door and said "Hello po" in English, and we had a perfectly pleasant conversation about where I was from and what I thought of the weather, and whether I liked Lechon, which I do. And then, within about 10 minutes of my first ever seeing this woman, she asked whether I might have any work for her brother-in-law. He was very hard-working, she said, very reliable, good with repairs and lifting and general maintenance. She mentioned this quite naturally, in the same tone you might recommend a restaurant. I said I'd think about it, which was a lie, but a polite one, and seemed the appropriate response. I talked to Phil that evening. He wasn't surprised. He explained that this is simply how the Filipino family economy operates. It's not malicious. It's not a scheme. It's just that a foreign employer represents opportunity, and opportunity is something you share with your network, if you can. The concept of utang na loob runs deep. You help your people, they help theirs. The obligation circulates. Aling Nena wasn't trying to exploit me. She was doing what any sensible person does when they spot a resource that might help someone they're responsible for. But I wasn't obligated to respond to it, and I didn't. I did nothing, which Phil said was exactly right. No confrontation, no explanation, no awkward conversation with Marisel about her cousin. Just inaction, which is sometimes the whole of what's required. Aling Nena never came back. The subject was never raised again. I started going to the expat gatherings around month 8. A cafe called Brewed Awakening on one of the side streets near the Mandaue City Hall. A dozen or so foreign men on Thursday evenings. Mix of nationalities, mix of circumstances. Phil had been going for 2 years, and he introduced me around. I'll be honest with you about what I found there, because I think it's useful. There were 2 types, and the line between them was fairly easy to see. The first type were the bitter ones. Men who'd been burned, sometimes badly, sometimes badly enough that the bitterness was entirely earned, and who'd arrived at a worldview where every Filipino was a potential threat and every kindness was a transaction in disguise. They talked about women in ways that made me uncomfortable. They talked about the country in ways that seemed designed to confirm what they'd already decided. I found them exhausting. The second type were the ones who'd found workable lives. Phil was one. A German named Werner was another. Retired engineer, been in Cebu 11 years, spoke reasonable Cebuano, had a Filipino wife he clearly respected, and a small house in a village outside the city, where he'd lived for 7 of those years without apparent disaster. These men talked about the Philippines with the kind of affectionate exasperation you feel for somewhere you've genuinely come to understand. They'd made mistakes early on. They'd learned from them. They'd stopped being tourists in their own lives. One man at the gathering, a Scotsman from Dundee named Gordon, who'd arrived 2 years before me, told a story about building a house on his girlfriend's family land in Bohol. He described it as an investment. The house cost him 1.8 million pesos to build, about 30,000 euro, and he was proud of it. "Nice house," he said. 3 bedrooms, proper construction, good position on the land. Then the relationship ended, and he discovered what most people in that room already knew. Foreigners cannot own land in the Philippines. The house was on her family's land. He had no legal claim to either the structure or the ground it stood on. He lost everything he'd put into it. 1.8 million pesos, 30,000 euros. Gone. He told this story without self-pity, which I respected. He'd moved into a rental in Cebu, found a different woman through more conventional means, and was apparently doing fine. But 30,000 euro is not nothing for a retired Scotsman on a pension, and I sat with the numbers for a while after he'd moved on to other subjects. I thought, that could have been me, in a different story. I'm not so different from Gordon except in the specific choices I made. A different man walks off a plane in Cebu, meets a woman in a bar, falls for her, starts building things on land he can't own. It's not stupidity, it's hope. The same thing that brought Gordon to the Philippines brought me here, dressed in different clothes. The emotional proximity thing came up around month 9, and it's the one I want to address carefully, because I think it's the subtlest risk of all the ones I encountered. I noticed that I'd started asking Marisel's opinion on things. Not about cleaning or laundry, about other things. Whether I should renew my lease for a year or stick to 6 months. Whether the plumber the building recommended was reliable, or whether I should find my own. Small decisions, none of them urgent. But I was running them past her before making them, in the way you might run something past someone you trust. I caught myself doing this and examined it. The important question was whether I was treating her professional knowledge as professional knowledge, or whether I was treating it as something else, a substitute for the kind of domestic intimacy that I hadn't had since Marie died, and which, if I was honest, I missed in ways I didn't often let myself acknowledge. I decided it was the former, not because I was certain, but because the relationship had clear structure. Contract, defined hours, professional arrangement, and I wasn't confusing it with anything else. I was consulting a local expert. That's what she was. But I noted the tendency, and I stayed alert to it, because the structure was what protected both of us, and the structure required that I not romanticize what it was. She was my employee, a good one, a useful one, a person I respected, not my companion, not my confidant, not a replacement for any of the things I'd lost or never had. Just a woman doing her job well, in a flat in Mandaue, in a country that was slowly becoming somewhere I knew how to live. Month 12 arrived. The savings account had not been touched. The household cost was running at about 50,000 pesos a month, 830 euro, and the pensions were covering it with room to spare. The arrangement with Marisel was stable, professional, and functional. The arrangement with Ryan was the same. And then my phone rang. Australian number, MAID, from Brisbane. I'm still in Mandaue, 14 months now. The balcony table I made from the woodworking gear is holding up well. The garden Ryan tends has some kind of small, flowering shrub in it that I don't know the name of, but which blooms yellow in the dry season, and which I have become unreasonably fond of. Cenead rang in March. I was on the balcony with my coffee, 8 in the morning. The street below already busy with the sound of tricycles and someone's radio, and the particular quality of Mandaue morning light that I've grown accustomed to, in the way you grow accustomed to things you initially found difficult. She said she was just checking in. She said she'd been meaning to ring for a while. She said I sounded different. I said I supposed I did. She asked if I'd met someone, and I said no, not in the way you mean. She didn't quite know what to do with that, so after a short pause she asked about the weather, and I told her it was warm, and she said that sounded nice, and we talked for about 20 minutes about nothing much, and then said our goodbyes. I sat with the phone after she'd rung off. Not unhappily. I'm not going to tell you the call filled some void or that it resolved anything. It was a 20-minute conversation with a daughter I barely know as an adult, about weather and food and whether I was managing all right. But she'd rung, and she'd said I sounded different. And I thought, yes, I suppose I do. I've been working on the visa situation, and my tourist visa has been extended twice. The Bureau of Immigration here allows extensions up to 36 months in total before you need to leave and re-enter, but I'd rather have something more stable. Phil referred me to a licensed agent who handles SRRV applications. That's the Special Resident Retirees Visa, the long-term residency arrangement for foreign retirees. It requires a deposit of $20,000 for applicants over 50, held in a Philippine bank, which can be invested in certain approved instruments. I'm proceeding with that, through proper channels, with verified documentation, the way I'd approach anything. I'm not in a hurry. I haven't met a romantic partner. I'm not sure whether I want to. That's a question I've set aside for now. And not because it frightens me, but because I haven't found a version of an answer that feels honest rather than convenient. There are women at the Thursday evenings who are with foreign men and seem content. There are women who are with foreign men and are something more complicated than content. The whole subject has a weight to it that I'm not yet sure I want to carry. Maybe I will someday. Maybe not. I've made my peace with the uncertainty, which is more than I could have said 14 months ago. What I want to talk about, for anyone still watching, is the thing I actually learned. Because there's a lesson in this story, and it's not the obvious one. Underground, you trust the structure or you don't come back up. The structure is the whole of it. The props, the timbers, the ventilation, the safety protocols, the communication systems. Every one of these things was developed because someone, at some point, improvised and paid for it. You don't get clever with safety. You don't decide that the procedure is too slow or too cautious or designed for other people. You follow it because you understand that your own judgment, however good, is not better than the accumulated knowledge embedded in the protocol. The Philippines is exactly the same. I don't mean that it's dangerous. Most of it isn't. I mean that the structure exists. Use a legitimate agency. Get the clearances. Sign a contract and read it. Set the terms clearly at the start. Pay on time and in full. Address drift when it's small. Learn to say no in a way that preserves the dignity of both people. Don't blur the lines between professional and personal. Not because the line is obvious, but because Blurring it costs you the protection the structure provides. The men in Gordon's situation, and in the worst situations I've heard about at those Thursday evenings, were mostly not stupid men. They weren't naive in the way people sometimes assume. They were men who arrived here with hope and loneliness, and the entirely reasonable desire to build something, and they got clever with the safety protocols. They decided that the procedures applied to other people, or that their specific situation was different, or that one small exception wouldn't matter. It matters. That's the whole lesson. The exception is where the drift begins. What a helper provides, beyond the obvious. She is a daily operational anchor in a country you don't yet fully understand. She is a source of local knowledge, with no financial stake in your decisions beyond the modest one of keeping her employment stable. She is a check on the 1,000 small judgments you'll make every week about prices and landlords and tradesmen and transactions, where your inexperience is invisible to you until someone points it out. She costs roughly 75 to 90 euro a month, depending on experience and duties and where in the country you're living. She is worth considerably more than that. If you're considering this, go through an agency. Verify their credentials. Ask for NBI clearance and barangay clearance for any candidate. Read the standard contract. Set the hours clearly on the first day. Pay on the date you agreed. When something drifts, address it. When you say no to a request, say it in a way that allows both of you to move forward. And do not, under any circumstances, confuse genuine cultural obligation with manipulation. They are different things. They require different responses, and the difference matters. I came here for the cost of living and the weather. The cost of living is as advertised. The weather is warm enough that I think about shade at 9 in the morning and have stopped thinking of this as a hardship. The balcony table is solid. The yellow flowering shrub is in bloom. I'm not fixed. I don't think that's the word. But I know what I'm doing most days, which is more than I could say for the 6 years I spent rattling around Leitrim telling myself I was fine. That, for what it's worth, is the difference. That's Brendan's story, and we're grateful to him for sharing it. Here on Inside the Philippines, we spend a lot of time with men who lost things: money, dignity, years of their lives, the savings they'd spent decades building. Those stories are real, and they matter, and we'll keep telling them. But Brendan's story matters too, in a different way. Because the cautionary part isn't about what he lost. It's a precise account of how to arrive in a new country, on your own, in the second half of your life, without losing the things that matter. If you're thinking about hiring a helper, and if you're moving to the Philippines, you should be. Here is what Brendan did. He used a registered agency. He asked for NBI and barangay clearances before agreeing to anything. He signed a written contract with defined hours, defined duties, and defined rates. He paid on time. He set terms clearly from the start and addressed small deviations before they became large ones. With current wage rates for helpers in the Cebu area run from 4,500 pesos to 6,000 pesos a month, depending on experience and responsibilities. That's roughly 75 to 100 euro, or 85 to 115 US dollars. For that, you get someone who knows the terrain in ways you don't. Treat the arrangement professionally, and it will function professionally. And there's something else in Brendan's story that we think is worth naming directly. Loneliness is the engine underneath almost every story we tell on this channel. Men come here lonely, or they arrive and become lonely, and that loneliness is what the bad actors find and use. Brendan found a partial answer to his in a professional arrangement with a 43-year-old woman from Leyte who arrived at 7 in the morning. Did her work well. Yurten quietly told him when he was about to do something structurally unsound. It's not a romantic answer, It's not a dramatic one, but it was real, and it worked. And he is still there, on his balcony, next to his homemade table, watching the yellow flowers. We'll see you next time on Inside the Philippines.